on the mic, grab a seat, it's the Kickback Science crew. Dr. Luke and his friends, ready to drop some knowledge true. Traveling the world, exploring health and wellness for you, kicking the science. Kickback Science, come vibe with us. Kickback Science, we'll kick the funk and discuss. We're breaking it down, moving to the beat.
The information we discuss in this podcast is not meant to be taken as medical advice. It is simply informative. We're not affiliated with any organization or institution, just a few guys talking science and having fun.
I feel like that was
Yeah.
You guys ready to get started on this one?
I'm freaking ready.
You ready?
I'm always ready. I'm always ready.
Always ready. All right, we are doing the last matchup of our Battle of the Diets, the last one. So we're going to do low carb versus low fat diet. So we're going to do both of them in one shot here today.
Low fat.
So first off, we're going to start with the low carb diet. So Luke, you want to go into that one?
Yeah. I feel like we can probably cover these together in a way. Because, I mean, they are opposite, but in the research, they tend to be compared against each other. The low-fat diet has been around and been pushed a lot more for a lot longer period of time. And it came out of some research, actually, the University of Minnesota, Ansel Keys, back in the 70s, I believe, did a study showcasing the effects of saturated fats and how fat is having an influence on cardiovascular disease. And so, and that took a lot of steam, and people repeated certain aspects of these studies. And we then at that point thought fat is the cause of all of our issues. And so you see all these food companies making low fat products.
Yeah.
And
I remember growing up, coming home to low fat salad dressings, low fat sour cream, low fat milk, low fat this, that.
everything low fat.
Everything.
Yeah, and that was like the food pyramid that was recommended to everyone. Like fat should make up the smallest component of what you're eating. And then we started shifting into, well, maybe it's not fat as much as it is sugar consumption. And that's more pushed now, like low sugar, sugar substitutes to try to decrease the impacts that sugar has on health. And then, what do you say when you're doing like theater? Like QN, keto diet, QN low carb diet, where it's, okay, there may be some independent effect that sugar's having on our health.
How long ago did keto kind of start coming around? I want to say it wasn't more than like 10 years ago.
It's been longer than that. When I was, would have been late in my undergrad, I went down to South Africa and actually got to meet with Tim Noakes, who's one of the pioneers of the ketogenic diet. And he had written a book at this point called The Real Meal Revolution. Was very established in the field, still is to this day. He actually is like involved. Reed, you were there.
That was, I know, I was like, I can vouch for you.
Yeah.
I was there.
So, me and Reed were in South Africa together.
That guy's a
part
big
of like
deal.
a research thing for the university.
Sweet.
Yeah. So Tim Noakes, he gave us a lecture, and I read his book, The Real Meal Revolution, back then. I did the keto diet for a while. I was 100% convinced on it. But at this time point, he had already put out a ton of research showcasing the benefits of a keto diet, which we'll dive into. And he wasn't the first one to discover this. He just happened to have kind of like paved this path for all these people that were studying keto and low carb specific diets. But yeah, he's definitely like, he started these organizations and has been involved in all these lawsuits and stuff, and kind of a bummer, but so it has been around for a while, but definitely not as long as the low fat stuff. But we still see the food industry try to step in and support these diet approaches where they're making like low sugar, 30% less sugar here.
Well, they just replace it with sucralose.
Yeah, well, and added, so like you have these artificial sweeteners that reduce the the glycemic index, which we'll talk about, and don't have this influence that sugar does, but they're still sweetened, and so people can still drink them. And whether or not that has a difference on your health, we'll touch on a little bit in this podcast. But doing a podcast on artificial sweeteners and why am I blanking on just like processed foods, artificial sweeteners, preservatives, and all these added components to foods, because we do not like to go into that in this podcast. Like that's a completely separate discussion. We'll touch on it. Yeah. But yeah, that's a whole separate avenue to go down. But so low carb diets were really popular, or have become really popular because of this. It's actually the carbohydrate insulin model of obesity, which there's a group, Robert Ludwig, he's over at the Boston Children's Hospital. He's a clinical endocrinologist. He's kind of leading the way in this carbohydrate insulin model of obesity, which suggests that it is actually the increase in insulin that we see in response to carbohydrates. So when you take in carbohydrates, they are going to be absorbed and circulate around in your bloodstream as glucose. And that spike in glucose causes your pancreas to release insulin. We've touched on this a little bit in other podcasts, where insulin's that chaperone, glucose are the troublemaking kids running around the bloodstream, and insulin goes and grabs them and brings them back home to their homes of muscle cell and liver specifically, and also adipose tissue to a smaller extent, and adipose tissue being fat. Now, that rise in insulin to take care of that glucose load actually shuts off this hormone called hormone-sensitive lipase. And hormone-sensitive lipase, well, it's an enzyme, breaks down fat and mobilizes fatty acids from stored fat and sends them out into the bloodstream. So basically breaks down fat and allows you to utilize it for energy. So if you have this increase in insulin, you're dropping this oxidation of fat or utilization of fat, burning of fat. And we know that an accumulation of fat causes so many downstream metabolic effects. So the increased fat content, if you have an increased fat, you're more at risk for cancer, metabolic disease, diabetes, obesity, you name it, contributes to all these disease conditions. And so if we can drop body fat specifically by decreasing insulin. So if insulin's not around, that hormone-sensitive lipase is active, we're breaking down fat, mobilizing it, using it for energy, then theoretically you would decrease body fat. And so that's this carbohydrate insulin model, which would suggest, okay, decrease carbs, because if you decrease carbs, then you're not going to have that spike in insulin, which will allow you to burn more fat. But the problem with this, go ahead, Joe.
So insulin is the guy that is bringing glucose places.
Yeah, it's
so if you
driver.
drop your carb and you drop your insulin levels, there's less insulin to bring those glucose places.
But there's less glucose to bring places. And that's kind of the point is insulin responds to glucose. If you drop carbohydrate intake, you're dropping glucose. And so insulin doesn't really have to do anything. You still have the ability to release insulin. That's not going to change. It's just your body doesn't need to. It's not going to secrete insulin because there's not this high circulating glucose around in your bloodstream. And so this addresses one part of this equation of it really all comes back to this energy in, energy out model of trying to lose fat. And if you can lose body fat, so if you have excess body fat, you're less metabolically healthy, susceptible to all these diseases. If you can lose body fat, you're going to be healthier. And so again, in comes low carbohydrate diets where, now we are ramping up this process of breaking down adipose tissue, breaking down fat. So we're going to see fat loss over time. But the problem is you're increasing fat storage when you go low carb, high fat. And so you're then increasing the amount of fatty acids that get stored as adipose tissue. And so you've got more fat being stored, but you're also burning more fat. And let's counter that with a low-fat diet. So what is a low-fat diet doing here? It's addressing the other side of the equation. So a low-fat diet, let's say, is often higher in carbohydrates, because usually it is. So higher carbohydrates, more insulin response, decrease in hormone-sensitive lipase, decrease breaking down fat, but you're storing less fat because you're taking in less fat. So there's two completely different sides to the equation that need to be addressed, but these two arguments only really address one of them. And so this also can kind of open up a can of worms in this fat burning zone type stuff. And, this product burns more fat, and if you exercise here, you're burning more fat. That does not mean you're losing fat. Okay, that just means you're burning more fat at that time point. Fat storage still absolutely comes into play. Caloric intake and storing fatty acids specifically as adipose tissue. People just think that fat oxidation is the same thing as fat loss. That's not true. That's just a pathway.
So what is fat oxidation?
It's just a process of breaking down, mobilizing fatty acids from your adipose tissue, breaking down and utilizing fat as energy. So you are breaking down fat. But that, again, that's just one side of the equation.
Right.
You're still storing fat there. So you need a net loss. So a net drop in fat from fat oxidation versus fat storage in order to lose fat. So you could do all the fat burning. When we're just sitting here, like, majority of the energy we're burning is fat. So I could say, like, right now I'm in a huge fat burning zone. I'm burning tons of fat relative to other substrates. But you could be in a fat burning zone for so long. If you're taking in excess energy, it's going to be stored as fat. And so that's the issue or one of the issues that kind of comes into play here with low carb and high or low fat specifically, is this idea that one's going to burn more fat and cause fat loss. It doesn't seem to play out that way.
I was also seeing that, like, they're saying, like, usually people on the low carb diet, like the keto diet, they are eating less calories because they're getting more full from all the proteins and fats they're eating compared to people that aren't doing that. So that's another thing with them losing weight, or that's how people see more weight loss. At least that's what I saw in the videos from the nutritionists that I was watching.
And that's another really popular way to approach this, is that sugar is somehow making us hungrier, and that there's not a satiety aspect. So satiety being like feeling full after you eat. There's not a satiety aspect of carbohydrates, and that fat has higher satiety. Now, when you look into the research, though, that doesn't necessarily hold true. There's a variety of studies. So one that is getting a ton of heat right now that we'll come back to in a second. Kevin Hall, he pioneers this area of obesity research called the energy balance model, which is more addressing, like, we are over consuming food because of, it's not very nutrient dense. Well, we'll touch on that. Yeah, I mean, it's highly processed, not nutrient dense, high calorie dense. We don't feel full for those reasons. We tend to overconsume, and that's what's driving obesity, is this overconsumption, as opposed to this high insulin, increased fat storage, and this carbohydrate insulin model that suggests that it's actually this insulin that's creating this state of our body where our body thinks we're in this energy deficit, causing us to eat more. So there's two total sides of the debate, which I think I want to come back to, because recently, as recent as last night, this debate on Twitter between that Robert Ludwig and Kevin Hall is hotter than ever right now between the two of them.
Good timing.
It's fun following them on Twitter. Yeah, this is really good timing, actually. But anyway, so Kevin Hall put out a paper that this is what the debate is on right now, of looking at energy intake on a low carb versus low fat diet. And they had them come into these metabolic wards where it's essentially like a room apartment like this where people come and they actually like move into this lab for a month. And that way you can monitor everything they're doing as far as activity, and you can provide all the meals so you know caloric intake and you can accurately estimate caloric
Can they ever
expenditure
leave
there.
that room, or are they stuck in that
They can leave the room. And
Oh,
so
okay,
they
I was
try to
gonna say,
make
like,
it
a
as
month.
like so they can actually go outside, but they have to be with one of the researchers.
Are they doing their like normal daily activities, like going to work and then
No.
just like coming home,
No,
living there? Or
so they're
they
getting
are-
paid a ton of money to
Okay, I
come.
was gonna say, but I feel like it almost be well. Then you can't control the food aspect.
Yep.
As quite
and
as
that's
good.
the most important thing right here is, so essentially what they did is they told these individuals, this is not a weight loss study. You can eat as much as you want. We're just going to provide you different meals. And what they did is they had them for 2 weeks consume a low carb meal, and then for 2 weeks have a low fat meal. These amounts were very, very, very different. Like the high carb was high carb. The low fat was low, or the low carb was low, like low carb. And they just looked at what's happening with energy intake. And they actually found that the individuals on the low fat diet, just naturally, when they were told they could eat as much as they want, reduced energy intake overall. And so they didn't feel as though they needed to eat quite as much. But then when they assessed these individuals, they felt, similar in terms of their responses to the diet. But that's one aspect of the satiety here. There's a few other papers that we can touch on and that I'll link to, because we don't have, I don't want to spend so much time on the satiety aspect, but there is a meta-analysis from 2019 that looked at dietary fat and fiber and satiety and found that fat didn't have an increased satiety component unless fiber was included with it, which fiber is a type of carbohydrate. And then there's kind of a cool study that looked at satiety index of different foods. This is often cited in the literature, where they took 38 different foods and assessed how people felt as they took in the same exact amount as far as calories of different types of food. And then they assessed them over a period of time, saw how full they were. And guess what? Well, I can't have you guess because there's something you could try.
Let's try.
Guess.
I wanna try.
Yeah. So like they test different foods, like pizza, cheese, a bagel,
Love pizza.
Love
chicken. So guess what the most satiety-inducing food that they gave these individuals were? Like it resulted in them feeling the most full.
Well, I mean,
Protein?
I would say pizza.
Well, not groups, Reed. So, like, as far as a
Oh.
group goes, protein,
Yeah.
it resulted in them feeling full.
I'm
We
so
know this, like the
fucking
satiety aspect of protein.
I'm going pizza.
So if you're trying
Pizza.
to like do a diet to make you feel fuller, quit wasting your time with carbs or protein. Like,
Yeah.
carbs or fat. Increase protein. Crying out
Seriously.
loud. But yeah, so when they tested these different types of foods, just take a wild guess. What did you say?
I said pizza. So
I
I
think
guess
that's the most filling. Like in the same
here's
amount
a
of
question.
calories.
How long of a period are they looking for the satiety?
So I believe they did 5 hours.
Okay,
I'll
so
have to pull up
5
the study.
hours. I mean, if I ate a whole pizza, I probably would be hungry
Sorry,
again.
2
5
hours. They asked them
2 hours.
They asked them every
I'd be
15
full
minutes
for
over
2
2 hours.
on after eating a whole pizza.
Well, it's a matter of how full.
How full?
Yep. So
Well,
eating.
if I ate a whole pizza, I'd be really full.
But so yeah, but I mean, it's 240 calories was each food, 240 calories, and they just took 240 calories of pizza, 240 calories of ice cream, 240 calories of cereal. So it's the same amount of calories. What
Okay.
tended to make you feel more full?
That got a lot harder now.
Yeah. do we have,
You're not gonna get it
do
because
we have an
it's so
A, B,
random.
C, D that we can pick from?
Sure. I'll make it A, B, C, D. So, let's
Don't look at him because he'll give the
Yeah.
answer away.
Let's go with bread, chicken, baked potato, broccoli.
Chicken.
Baked potato.
Chicken.
baked
Oh,
potato,
what?
dude.
Baked
Baked potato,
potato.
like by far, was the most satiety-inducing type of food. But the problem is like, you know, no one's going to just overeat a straight up baked potato. Like, that's pretty clear. It makes sense when you think about it. But we throw a ton of salt and butter and cheese on our
Twice
baked potato.
baked potato?
And then you can eat a million of them. But yeah, it was the most satiety inducing. Now, the thing is protein overall increased satiety more than any other type of food, regardless of the fat and carbohydrate content. There's also papers showing a short-term satiety effect of just different types of sugars. And this was a review that included papers that assessed short-term satiety after 2 hours. And they looked at different like high glycemic index types of foods and low glycemic index. Glycemic index is when you take in that food, how high does it spike your blood sugar and then spike your insulin. And when you take in like a soda or a lot of like fruit juices and anything with these simple sugars in them, especially in liquid form, those are higher glycemic index. And even things like, you know, candy and such, they spike your blood sugar a lot more than things like complex carbohydrates that are, you know, in a baked potato or in other types of whole foods that are what we call oligosaccharides. They're a bunch of different sugars bound to each other that is harder for your body to break down, so they don't spike blood glucose quite as much as these monosaccharides and disaccharides, which is just straight up like glucose, and then sucrose is glucose and fructose together.
I might be going a little off topic, but recently, again, I've heard that if you take a fruit and blend it, it breaks down that sugar and it is way more easily absorbed in your body and makes that sugar level spike like way higher, right?
Than if you were to eat it just normally.
Than if you were to eat it normally. Is that bullshit?
So there's some truth to that in terms of like liquid calories spike this blood sugar more because your body doesn't have to break through those like fibrous components that are binding up all the nutrients in there. And so you could see this increase glycemic response if you blended a bunch of fruit and drank it in a liquid form. But people try to bring that up as if it's like super bad for you. That's not the case here. Like, you're still getting the nutrients from that fruit that you're looking for. It's not like it's changing what you're taking in. Like some people are like, oh, you change the like actual like chemical bonds within the fruit here themselves, and it makes the nutrients different. That's absolutely not happening.
That's weird because like I was looking and people were like, what are the most unhealthy drinks? And people were like naming off like sodas and stuff. But then they put naked juices like the number one unhealthy, which that's what
number
makes
one
me
healthy?
think unhealthy is like the naked juices, which you think, oh, that's just blended up fruits and veggies and stuff. Like that is,
I feel like
healthy, and those tend to be.
In my mind, though, like that's like mass produced, right? So there is that potential of it being negative. And Luke's shaking his head, no, it's not. But if I'm gonna make a fruit smoothie, I'm gonna make it at home. But I don't even do that because I'm not a big smoothie guy. So anyway. So naked juice is.
I don't like this idea. This is a lot of people in the low carb community that have this anti-sugar outlook and this idea that the sugar content in your food that you're taking in is what makes it unhealthy. And so naked juice having a very high sugar content, and I don't think it was you, Reed, that sent that video to me. It was someone else, but I think I know what video you're talking about.
I might have.
And they compared it to like, it was like some crazy stuff like Mountain Dew.
Yeah, it was a list of like 10 items. Like I would
so.
guess what was unhealthy, and then like naked juice ended up being like number one.
And when you look at them, it was just based on the sugar content, but they're saying like fruit juices are worse than, or way, way worse than all these like sodas and things. It's like, no, that's just, they're going off of the sugar content there. And so that would then generate the hypothesis that sugar is inherently bad. There's some independent effect of sugar. And when you look into the data there, that's not as clear as it sounds. And it's because a lot of the research isn't controlling for calories. We brought this up with the calorie restriction research that we talked about, where you can make a point for an intervention if you have your participants calorically restricted. We see those health benefits occur, especially when we're talking about things like fat loss and insulin sensitivity. Fat is an independent cause of all these metabolic issues. We've talked a lot about that. If you can have someone drop body fat, metabolically, they're going to be healthier. They're going to have lower resting glucose, lower insulin, better insulin responses, lower body fat. They're going to lose weight. So a lot of these studies that don't control for calories, if the group they're testing, so like low carb, for example, a lot of the research on low carb, they're calorically restricted versus the groups they're comparing them to. And so when that happens, it's not the low carb diet as much as it is the caloric restriction. Well, then you could say, well, on a low carb diet, you eat less, so you're calorically restricted. So therefore you have these benefits. But we just went over, it's the satiety impact is not as clear as that. Fat in one of these reviews, they say that fat doesn't have as much satiety influence. Let me pull it up so I don't miscite the study. So here in the 2019 meta-analysis, owing to the high energy density, fat per kilojoule had a weak effect on satiation as compared by the effect per gram for each unit of energy. The addition of fiber theoretically improves satiety by slowing the absorption of various nutrients, including fat. So, and this is a meta-analysis, which again is a study of studies, which those give us the most accurate view of where the data are at. And when we look into a lot of studies, you'll see people pull one study of a certain group of people that showed a specific outcome. And those studies tell us a lot. They really do. I'm not bashing on those studies, but when you can compile a group of similar studies, specifically randomized controlled trials that control for all these variables and can pile them together and look at the results as a whole, it gives us so much more information. So that's why we go over so many meta-analyses here, is because when we're trying to look at the group of evidence, that's what we want to show. So back to this argument against sugar. People are bashing on sugar. And it seems to be, when you look into the research, if calories and protein are equated, and protein is super important to equate in these studies too, because protein has its own independent influence on caloric expenditure. It has a high thermic effect of food, meaning you burn calories when you take in more protein. So it's going to contribute to things like weight loss, body fat, and also has an influence on insulin sensitivity. So we need to control for protein and we need to control for calories in these studies if we're comparing two groups. That makes sense, right?
Yep.
When we're talking sugar, a lot of people are concerned about obesity. So from a 2017 meta-analysis, this looked at 28 different studies and looked at short and moderate term isoenergetic trials, meaning that the calories were matched here. And substituting different types of sugars, whether it be your simple sugars for complex carbohydrates. So changing the type of sugar here had no effect on blood pressure or body weight at all. And there's another paper, a meta-analysis in 2012 that showed the same thing. So there's no difference in weight, body composition, and these other metrics of metabolic health when, you're adding different types of sugar. And they even looked at like fructose, sucrose, and complex carbohydrates. And so we point fingers at all these simple sugars, like the added sugars in our drinks and just sugars in general. And it doesn't seem to play out this way. But the problem comes in is when you look at overconsumption of these. And fructose specifically has a pretty bad rap in here. And fructose, so there's a paper that actually looked at, this is a meta-analysis here that looked at 31 isocaloric, so matching calories, and 10 hypercaloric studies of fructose. So hypercaloric, they actually increased intentionally the amount of calories they were taking in, and that increase was made up of fructose. So we can see, okay, is there a difference between if you're just eating fructose but you're not over consuming versus if you are
What are some
over-consuming.
examples of fructose? Is that like high fructose corn syrup, like you drink in pops and stuff?
Yep,
Or?
exactly.
Okay.
So fructose is in the high fructose corn syrup. Sucrose, also like table sugar, has glucose and fructose. There is fructose in a ton of different fruits, and also honey is really high in
Okay.
fructose.
What about pure maple syrup?
That stuff's
I've
good.
heard pure maple syrup is a diuretic.
I don't know the answer to that question. We could come back to it.
I mean,
I haven't heard that before.
well, I guess we'll have to figure that out at some point.
But so back so if we're talking fructose, because that tends to be the issue that people bring up is like, okay, fructose contributing to metabolic disease. When you look at the isocaloric studies, so the ones that control for calories, the meta-analysis, they conclude that fructose does not seem to cause weight gain when it's substituted for other carbs in diets providing similar calories. Free fructose at high doses provided excess calories, free fructose at high doses that provide excess calories, moderately increase body weight, an effect that may be due to extra calories rather than fructose. So they actually were not able to decipher, was it fructose independently that's causing these, or was it just this added calorie intake, because the responses they saw were similar to what you would see with just over consumption in general here. So it doesn't seem to have this a independent effect. And then another review of a meta-analysis of 15 studies. This came out in, I gotta pull up the paper here. This was a 2017 meta-analysis, and they looked at 15 studies and concluded that the current evidence does not allow us to conclude that fructose-containing sugars, independent of food form, are associated with increased risk of type 2 diabetes. They looked at total sugars, sucrose, and fructose. And so this anti-sugar thing it doesn't seem to be playing out this way. I mean, overconsumption is a different story, in animal research too. I mean, it's interesting when you look into the animal studies with fructose specifically and see all these things like liver fat accumulation, and these are in matched calorie intake models where so fructose can't be metabolized in all tissues of the body like glucose can, and the liver has an enzyme called fructokinase that is able to start the process of breaking down fructose. And so all the fructose has to get shuttled to the liver. And so when the liver is going through this process and breaking down fructose and storing that fructose within the liver, you end up building up all this fat in the liver, and that causes
fatty liver
disease.
And so I know we're talking about soda, pop. I guess I'm from Minnesota. I gotta say pop.
I know I said soda earlier. I'm like, what?
What are you doing?
I know.
Alcohol, same effect with the sugars in alcohol.
Yeah, so you have non-alcoholic fatty liver diseases, which is what we were just kind of talking about, and then you do have alcoholic fatty liver disease because the process of metabolically breaking down alcohol happens in the liver, which also contributes to this fat accumulation, but the disease is separate. So you hear NAFLD and AFLD. So alcoholic fatty liver and then non-alcoholic fatty liver. Non-alcoholic fatty liver is due to this overconsumption, which some people may say it's just straight up due to fructose alone. But I'd argue that the evidence just isn't there. Maybe, fructose is having this independent effect. It does make sense mechanistically, but we would probably see that we would see that play out in these meta-analyses specifically if fructose was having this independent effect. And so, yeah, it doesn't seem, sugar doesn't seem to be this enemy that everyone.
Well, and when you get the alcohol, fatty liver tends to be when you're over consuming alcohol, right?
Well, no, alcohol in general, it goes through that process in the liver, and it's not over consuming alcohol in general. It's just like the impact that alcohol alone has.
So alcohol goes just like straight to
alcohol
the liver?
has zero benefit to you whether you consume a sip or you consume a case. There's
So you're
not
saying
a benefit.
if I were to have a case or one, it's going to have the same exact effect. All right, well.
What I'm not saying.
Yeah, no, that's not, I know.
Can we go over the benefits of the low carb and the low fat? Like, why would people choose one over the other?
Yes. So, low carbohydrate diets, a lot of people tend to adhere to them pretty well. And when you look at the research in utilizing a low carbohydrate diet versus other types of diets or versus low fat specifically, the weight loss is pretty quick right off the bat. You lose a lot of water weight when you go on these low carbohydrate diets initially. And that may contribute to this initial motivation, because what you see is when you look at these long-term studies that assess different diet approaches at like 3 to 6 month time points and then 1 year later. So there's a meta-analysis assessing this exact thing. And you'll see that the low carbohydrate diet adherence is a little bit better at that initial stage, but then when you assess again long-term after a year, there's no difference between the diets. So that initial process of starting the low carbohydrate diet, it does seem to be easier for people to adhere to, but that's not the case long-term.
Are they losing water weight because like carbohydrates, does that like soak up more water, or why are they losing all that water weight compared to the low fat?
You know, I wonder if it has anything to do with like muscle retaining water, and water gets stored with glucose when it's brought in and stored as glycogen. And so I just imagine, and this is my hypothesis here with water weight, is when you're breaking down glycogen stores as you would, you'd be storing less glucose, you'd have less glycogen, which if I didn't make sense of it already, glucose gets brought into the cell and gets stored as glycogen. Glucose, if it's not brought in and stored that way, it's going to be either broken down or be able to release out of the cell. And so when glucose comes in, your cell quickly tags it with a phosphate group that keeps it in the cell and also makes this concentration gradient, so more glucose will drive in. And then through a series of processes, depending on the metabolic needs of the cell, it'll either get broken down for energy or it'll get converted into glycogen. And that process involves the retention of water. And so if you're breaking down more glucose, you might be losing more water weight within the muscle. It makes sense to me. But I don't know if that's been directly studied there. So, but if we're talking benefits here.
Yeah.
Now, there's the adherence thing, it's not clear long term. It seems to be there's no difference depending on, there's actually a meta-analysis which... So there's a 2014 meta-analysis which actually just looked at low carb versus isoenergetic balanced diets on weight and cardiovascular risk. And so it was a balanced diet that had recommended intake of carbs, fat, and protein. They didn't, take some macronutrient.
What
and
is
try to
a
change it.
good balance?
The ranges are, if you look at like the guidelines, the recommendations, there's quite a range. It's like 45 to 65% carbs. And then what is it? Like proteins like 10 to 25 and fat is 20 to 35. I'm trying to recall based on an image that I have in my head. I suppose we could look them up, but
is that for low fat or is that for
no, that's just like
balance?
The general like American
the American. Okay.
I never follow the like guidelines like My Plate, Food Pyramid, and all that.
You're
stuff.
like 40, 30, 30. 40,
I don't actually know what my percentage is. I just go for my protein target and then my calorie goal, and however I get there, I don't care what I'm doing, fats versus carbs.
That's good to know because I was going to ask you about that.
And that's based on the research of like when you're calorically restricted,
right,
or when you're matching calories, the carb to fat ratio doesn't seem to make a difference.
Okay.
One of the best studies representing this, and I'll get back to the benefits and such too. I just want to make sure I don't forget this. So Kevin Hall's group, he's with the NIH. He's who I brought up that has this energy balance model of obesity and shows a lot of, it's not this like intrinsic component that's driving us to eat as much as it is we have increased access to food. It's highly processed. It's not very nutrient dense, and we tend to overeat for that reason, and that's what drives obesity. And I tend to agree with him because of this study and a variety of other ones. This one specifically, in my opinion, is the best tool we have to assess the difference between a low carb versus low fat, specifically, but really another diet. And it's a review of 32 studies that matched both calories and protein. You won't find this in these other reviews. It's very highly controlled. He only included studies where food was provided to the individuals to guarantee adherence here, because we tend to see, human participants aren't going to follow these diet recommendations long term, and compared a low fat versus a low carb diet and total energy expenditure and weight loss. Matched for calories and matched for protein, there was an increased fat loss in the low fat diet. Again, that based on the other meta-analyses that control for calories, there doesn't seem to be a difference between fat loss. But that's really my point, is whatever approach seems to work for you.
Yeah.
If you restrict calories, you're going to get the same outcome. There's not like this low carb.
And when you're doing a diet that you're adhering to, you've said it before, you tend to be more health conscious. You're working out. You're doing the right things to make you feel better. Can I we didn't really touch on the keto that much, like going into ketosis.
Yeah.
And the effects that has on the body. Like, I mean, there are some thoughts out there that it, with cancer and going into ketosis, it doesn't allow the cancer cells to grow. It like kind of puts them dormant. Is there a case to that?
So the idea that we could starve a cancer cell came from the Otto Warburg theory, or the Warburg theory from Otto Warburg, where he actually, when he isolated tumor cells and grew them in these petri dishes and exposed them to oxygen and substrates for them to go through oxidative phosphorylation, which is the process of bringing in substrates to the mitochondria that produces more energy, versus anaerobic glycolysis, which is taking glucose in, breaking it down for energy, and it doesn't require oxygen there. And when you go through high intensity exercise, your body relies on that anaerobic glycolysis. Anaerobic meaning ana is non, and then aerobic is with oxygen. So like no oxygen. So anaerobic glycolysis doesn't require oxygen, and it happens immediate. Your cells, muscle cells especially, are really good at breaking down glucose and utilizing it for energy before it can bring in and deliver everything to the mitochondria, utilize oxygen to convert energy. That process is still happening, but it takes longer. And it turns out that process of going through anaerobic glycolysis is among a variety of signals to your cell saying that it needs more. It's almost like in an energy deficit, and it needs more to grow. And cancer cells rely on this like increased glycolysis to shuttle a lot of energy towards producing more components to duplicate the cell. So it basically psychs the cell out to think that it needs to continue to grow. And so that process was observed where when cells are exposed to oxygen in a non-high stress environment, they're going to take it in and utilize it for oxidative phosphorylation, and that will slow down anaerobic glycolysis. But what Otto observed was that anaerobic glycolysis was still happening at this high rate, even when the cell was exposed to oxygen, could go through oxidative phosphorylation. So that then led to this theory of cancer cells are anaerobic. They use glucose for fuel, and that's true on certain aspects. But there's a lot of newer emerging evidence, and I shouldn't say newer, this actually has been in the last decade demonstrated pretty well, where oxidative phosphorylation is still happening at the same rate in those cells. Those cancer cells are just amazingly brilliant in the fact that they can keep anaerobic glycolysis active at this high rate while simultaneously going through oxidative phosphorylation. And the cell needs to do that when it's cancerous because it has to keep growing and keep building. It needs energy. It needs to signal these processes to grow, versus your normal cell wouldn't be doing that. So we know now that oxidative phosphorylation is still happening in tumor cells, but that still doesn't set aside this point of if we could starve those cells of glucose, is it going to impact the cell's ability to continue to grow? And there were some promising results in like doing a ketogenic diet here, but you're also starving the cell when you go on caloric restriction. So again, it keeps coming back to this, like, if you're on a calorie restriction, like just trying to starve the cell specifically of glucose isn't going to have that impact because the tumor cell can still use other substrates.
So you can't really pinpoint a way to starve that cell.
Yeah.
I mean, potentially, I guess.
Yeah, with diet specifically.
Okay.
And because it can still use other substrates to go through these metabolic processes. So the cancer cell can still thrive. Cancer cells are amazingly brilliant. Like, it is crazy.
Didn't you studied cancer in mice, right?
Yep. Yeah. So and in petri dishes, like I grew tumor cells all the time. It's crazy. You throw them in these dishes and like come back a couple days later and they've like exponentially grown, and then you inject them into an animal.
Do you
and
take the cancer cell out of like an animal with cancer and then like put it in a petri dish? How do you get that cancer cell?
So actually, what's really interesting is the process of developing all these, they're called immortal cell lines, came from, this is a crazy side tangent.
Yeah.
So there's this,
That was my fault.
There's this patient, Henrietta Lacks, way back when, I actually don't know when. Allie would know, she's probably out there somewhere. But there,
She's out there.
Henrietta Lacks, she was a patient where the hospital personnel, physician, whoever it was, took her blood, and she had these cells that they were able to isolate these cells that continuously grew. And they didn't ask her permission, but they kept these cells. And when you freeze a set of cells, they're going to stay viable if you freeze them. So we toss them in liquid nitrogen, and they're just kind of like frozen in this state.
Kind of
it's
like
kind
in
of
Austin
Captain
Powers,
Marvel or whatever.
When they freeze Austin.
Yeah, exactly. This is the same process as Austin Powers.
Yeah.
So you toss
Mojo.
you toss these tumor cells into liquid nitrogen. They're going to stay frozen. When you thaw them, you can grow them. If you put them in, it's not as simple as that. They're pretty fragile in certain ways, but you can thaw them and put them in their food that they want to eat in this petri dish. We call it media. It's got a ton of glucose in it because cancer cells love glucose, and then they'll just grow. But this Henrietta Lacks found out, wait a minute, you stole my cells and froze them down, and now they're contributing to all this research, and there were lawsuits on it. I bring up Allie because she read the book. They're called HeLa cells. Henrietta Lacks, HeLa. And there's a book
even
about
named it after her.
Yeah. And so these cells have actually established this cell line that labs use all around the world for these immortal cells. And then you can also, and from those, we've developed the technology to make these immortal cell lines, and then there's different cell lines that actually mimic different cancer types. So we've got these immortal cells that you can study different breast cancer cells, leukemia cells, and there's even different cells for like breast cancer for mice. And so it's really cool. And you buy these cells, you literally like buy tumor cells and you grow them. And then what we would do is we would take those up in a syringe and then inject them into a mouse. And you put them in certain areas of the tissue.
Sorry for all the PETA people out there.
Yeah, and actually, like that was not animal research is good in terms of you can get a lot more information out of it, but it's just when I was doing that, it was such like a dark experience. You know, you're down in
bet,
this
yeah.
lab and you end up having to like euthanize the poor animal. And
That's how
I hated it. And that's like what brought me to the medical school realm and pursuing the physician route, because it's like, I'd so rather talk and hang out with humans versus studying these animals. But
talking to
how did I
mice.
get on that tangent?
That was my fault. Oh yeah, I was.
Cancer benefits.
Oh, yeah,
ketosis.
cancer, glucose. Yeah. So, you know, we don't really have the answer to that question. What it seems to be, though, is like energy deprivation to the tumor cells is going to slow down their growth. You can get there from calorie restriction and not necessarily just glucose restriction. Because again, it turns out that tumor cells are still utilizing these other metabolic pathways. It's not like they can only utilize glucose. And that's a very important point, because people make that mistake a lot where in the low carb community, when they're preaching the low carb diet. And what I'm not saying is that low carb diets aren't beneficial. What I am trying to bring about is, if you don't respond well on a low carbohydrate diet, it doesn't matter, it seems, if you pick a different diet, you'll get the same benefits if you're matched calories and protein. And
I also read on the low carb that there's benefits for like neurological stuff. So epilepsy can help cure that, or not cure it, but like prevent that from happening. And also Alzheimer's. Is there truth to those? And also with low fat, I saw there's cardiovascular benefits for people with heart issues. Yeah.
So the epilepsy thing is super cool. This area of research is demonstrated very consistently, where you take a patient with epilepsy, which is essentially hyperactive neurons in your brain that cause these epileptic seizures. And it's difficult to intervene in epilepsy, but a ketogenic diet is really effective. And it's super interesting. The mechanisms those remain to be established, but yeah, people with epilepsy clearly benefit from a ketogenic diet for sure. Now, the Alzheimer's data, I'm not familiar with. Let me just take a quick peek. So just pulling up a meta-analysis here from 2022, and I'm just jumping right to the results here. And so I haven't read this study, obviously, and this isn't an area that I'm going to speculate much on, but they do highlight that there's a potential role of a ketogenic diet and really just being in ketosis and Alzheimer's disease. But they do say most current studies are small, often uncontrolled, and only look at short-term effects of ketosis on cognition. So there's still a lot of room for long-term research. So I don't know. I mean, maybe there is a role in Alzheimer's here.
Yeah.
Looks like we don't seem to have the answers to that. But again, I encourage
maybe we
people
should do
to
a
read
pod
it.
on Alzheimer's.
Yeah, we could.
And
totally, there's a lot.
Well, I don't know if you can. Well, whatever. Anyway,
Be fun to get some like neuro specialist person to come on and talk about that.
And then how about the low fat?
Yeah.
With cardiovascular
Oh,
health?
yeah. So, and that's why this all started, is this study by Ansel Keys at the U of M showing saturated fats increase heart disease. Saturated fats do influence this risk factor that is highly associated with cardiovascular disease, and that is LDL cholesterol. Now, when I say LDL, people are just going to hop into defense mode. LDL doesn't matter. It doesn't do anything. Now, the problem with the way that LDL is portrayed is we look at LDL as the number we get when we go to the doctor and they give us an LDL concentration. But the actual factor...
Before you keep going, LDL, HDL, can you just...
Yep, absolutely. So low density lipoprotein is what LDL stands for. A lipoprotein is almost like a vehicle, or you can think of it as like a public transit bus for fatty acids or triglycerides and cholesterol, because those cholesterol isn't able to just circulate around in your blood. So it needs a transport system to bring it around the blood. But the LDL versus, so like HDL, that's high density lipoprotein. That vehicle is thought of as the reverse transport mechanism of cholesterol, where it will actually go pick up all the cholesterol that was just delivered and bring it back to the liver to dispose of. So it almost is like thought of as reducing cholesterol. But there's a lot of debate on HDL and the role that it plays. So we think if there's an increase in HDL, we have this increase in reverse cholesterol transport, which actually will decrease our risk of cardiovascular disease, because if we have less cholesterol to transport, we're going to have less LDL, which is going to lead to less cardiovascular disease. There's a lot of, that's up for debate for sure, which would require a whole cardiovascular lecture. But low-fat diet, so if you can reduce saturated fat, you're going to have a reduce in LDL particle number specifically. We're not talking concentration. When your doctor takes your blood and you just look at the amount of cholesterol in the blood at that sample of blood that's taken, it doesn't tell you how many LDL particles are in your blood, because that's what contributes to this risk. And so, and there's a lot of debate on high LDL. Is it necessary and sufficient to cause disease? It seems to be that it is necessary but not sufficient. And what I mean by that is having a high LDL particle number doesn't mean you're going to get cardiovascular disease. But when you do have cardiovascular disease, you have a high LDL.
Now, when they take that LDL measurement, do they give you like a protocol, like don't eat 24 hours before, 8 hours before, or
most
don't
lipid
drink piss
panels
before?
Most lipid panels are going to be taken fasted, but you don't have to. They'll just have, there's a way that they can algorithmically estimate values. Same thing with glucose. When you go in, it should be fasted, but if it's a real-time glucose measurement, they'll say non-fasted glucose, which changes the range.
So they will mark whether or not it's fasted or not.
Yeah. Okay. It's always good to go in fasted for those. But so low-fat diet. It takes so long to answer these dang questions. Low-fat diet. Now, the idea is drop saturated fat, drop LDL cholesterol concentration. But it's really, there's so much other risk factors at play for cardiovascular disease. And there's this really interesting area of research with Robert Ludwig's group and a group over at Harvard that came out with this group of papers in the last few years that highlight this lean mass hyperresponders, where when they go on a ketogenic diet, individuals that are more lean and specifically have lower BMIs have a skyrocket in LDL number, and a skyrocket in HDL, and a drop in triglycerides. So those three things uniquely happen with people that have low BMI when they go on a low-carb diet. What's interesting, though, is this is just a natural metabolic response to this diet, and whether or not that actually is a risk factor remains to be discovered. So they're continuing to examine this and saying, like, wait a minute, if you're lean and you go on a low-carb diet and you have this high LDL, are you at more risk of cardiovascular disease, or are you somehow protected by some other mechanism that remains to be discovered? People are pointing to there's some protective effect of that is here in these individuals, and that LDL particle number may not actually be this crazy risk factor, because if it was, we would see these lean individuals who are on a low carbohydrate diet dying of cardiovascular disease. Again, this all remains to be discovered. People can speculate all they want and say that they know the answer, but ask any of these people studying it, they don't know the answer yet. But it's interesting because people with high BMI that go on a low carb, high fat diet, their LDL particle number drops significantly. And so you see this inverse relationship based on just BMI. So it's this lean mass hyper-responder model that is super interesting. All the listeners out there, like that, this area of research is going to be it already is really popular. You're going to start hearing about it more and more and more, especially as it relates to LDL cholesterol. So no, I wouldn't say the LDL or the low-fat diet is somehow protective of heart disease, because you can still overconsume, you can still have excess energy, excess fatty acids that are mobilized into the bloodstream, excess LDL particle number. You can still have all these things.
All those other risk factors that come into play.
And that also is true for the low carb diet. When people bash on the low carb diet saying like, oh, it increases LDL so much when you're having all these animal meat, saturated fat, LDL is going up. Now, people are still very metabolically healthy. And the LDL particle alone, it's a risk factor, but it doesn't cause this disease. And there's also studies that show, so when you do a keto diet, low carb diet, and you're calorically restricted as you should be, or you're iso or eucaloric, there isn't a significant change in LDL. And so if you're not over consuming either of these diets, you're not having these metabolic defects that seem to occur.
Can we go over the risk factors of both the low carb and low fat? Unless you're still working on the benefits there. I was seeing like the keto flu, people get like nauseous, they get headaches.
Oh,
they feel really kind of sick.
You could throw on the I mean, I've watched people do the keto diet, and there is a healthy keto diet, and there is also a unhealthy keto diet. Oreos. No. Not Oreos.
No, I think you are thinking of the Oreo reducing cholesterol.
Yeah, and then there's also like pork grinds. Those are keto, but it's literally a pig's ear or pig skin deep fried.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But how is that healthy?
So what's interesting is it all seems to come back to excess calories. Like, we haven't been able to ration out this independent influence of a macronutrient, including even fructose in those studies I was telling you, when it's not taken in excess calories. So,
okay.
But I'll bring that up again when I wrap everything up. The Oreo thing. Did you see a headline about someone eating Oreos?
Yes, I did. He changed. His diet. It was just a normal diet, and he was like, you know what? I'm going to eat 12 Oreos a day.
So he was actually
dropped his cholesterol.
So he's actually
Oreos
in
are
this
healthy.
lab that it has been exploring this lean mass hyperresponder model. He's at Harvard.
That's interesting because I literally just saw that I think yesterday.
So he did this to prove the model that they're exploring, because he was on a keto diet and he's in this low BMI category. So his cholesterol numbers skyrocketed, and he shared this stuff publicly. Like, he responded exactly how he thought. And then to prove that if he went off the keto diet, he could lower his cholesterol because it was super high being on the keto diet. So he goes on this Oreo diet, cholesterol numbers drop. But
so he stayed on the ketosis. He just added Oreos,
which would have brought him off of ketosis. He went out of the keto diet just to show like these effects are crazy in lean individuals, and you don't see that in obese individuals.
Wow. That's crazy.
Yeah, super cool. Like, but people are so mad at this guy saying like, that's just one study, blah blah. He's like, yeah, I was just trying to highlight what happened. I'm not trying to tell you that this is like the next.
You need to eat 12 Oreos a day.
He was basically saying, I can do something so extreme to show you the evidence of this model and what we're exploring. And it's really cool. And that's why I'm saying, like, you've seen this stuff come out from a study in Harvard, and like that stuff's going to be flowing out. That group though is on this carbohydrate insulin model of obesity that is one side of the extreme versus the energy balance model. So that group is going head to head with Kevin Hall right now, who's on the energy balance model at NIH. And that's the Twitter war that is just going crazy, is those guys and Kevin Hall, because they're trying to say what's actually causing overconsumption. And
so overconsumption, this kind of brings me to a thought I brought up to you a little bit ago, or yesterday actually, like, is sugar addictive?
oh yeah, we didn't talk about that.
Because I know for
Reed's
me,
like, dude, talk about the risks.
Just want to know the risks, man.
Well, I mean, this can be considered a risk, maybe, potentially. Because I don't know if when I used to drink during the weeks and then stop drinking during the weeks, sometimes have a drink on the weekend. But when I stopped, I was craving sugar still because there's sugar and alcohol, and still love sugar. And obviously, if I'm doing it correctly, it's not going to be detrimental if I'm not over consuming it. But that brings me to the thought is like, okay, is sugar addictive?
So the what you're describing as like if you're battling addiction and refrain from, what are you doing right now? Is your nose on the? It's like, you look really weird, and I don't know
Sorry,
what's going on.
I said the ADD is strong today.
Yeah.
It's very strong today.
So when you try to break addiction, you're still seeking reward and pleasure in certain ways. Food has a high reward aspect to it, and this is what's interesting too. That it pushes me away from this. That Harvard group that's studying this carbohydrate insulin model, when you examine people with obesity, they've been shown to have a higher reward pathway associated with food, even just viewing food, especially eating food. And so there is this like drive to consume more that is not directly related to insulin levels. And that brings, like, I have so much more to say about that. But anyway, we'll do another podcast
Joe.
just straight up. We'll do another podcast straight up on obesity. And actually, doctoral candidate Zach Roloff, shout out, have him come on and speak on that. A lot of his research relates to obesity, metabolic disease, and such. But anyway, so to get at your question about sugar being addictive, this has been studied. And this is... I hear people say like sugar's more addictive than cocaine and stuff like this. And it's this anti-sugar community that tends to be associated with low carb. But again, I'm not saying people that are on low carb are wrong. Low carb works so well for so many people, has so many uses, but it's not the right way to eat for everybody. Okay. And they tend to say, well, sugar's addictive and that's what causes you to overconsume too. But this has been studied. So, there's a YFAS survey. It's the Yale Food Addiction Survey, YFAS. And it was developed to assess people's feeling of addiction related towards different types of foods. And this has been studied in this has been studied. So a couple of different papers. So in one paper in 2017, they assessed a huge group of college students and gave them a bunch of different types of foods and looked at how their addictive response.
I can't get over the tutty, dude. That's pretty sweet. We should switch that word from studies to tutty.
So look at this tutty. Oh my gosh, let's do it. All right, so 2017 tutty.
All right.
I'm gonna start calling studies tutties.
I looked over at you and it just crushed me. I couldn't stop. All right.
Touchdown Vikings. So 2017 tutty on the food addiction related to a variety of different types of foods in a huge group of college students. This was actually done two separate tutties. So what they found with the foods and the foods that had a higher addictive scale, they were associated with high calorie density and just individual experience alone. So there was like this environmental influence to what types of foods felt addictive. And then the most addictive foods, when they classified them into groups, were high fat sweet foods compared to high fat savory foods. And then even lower on the addictive scale was sugar. And so the high fat sweet foods, not just fat, this is high fat with a sweet component.
So like
donuts,
sweet and sour chicken.
Yeah, sure.
I mean, like deep fried sweet and sour chicken.
Yeah, like
love
fat
that
and
shit.
sweet. And then in another paper with the Yale Food Addiction Survey, they showed that it's much more than sugar. And a lot of these foods actually had higher fat content relative to sugar. But what was common is there was this sugar, fat, salt, and even texture component to what makes foods addictive. So no, it's not sugar itself being addictive. I think we can clearly point to that. In fact, they do have I'm not even going to read the quote. I don't think I need to read the quote in the conclusion. We'll link to the studies and you can do that yourself. But essentially it is that it is not specific to sugar, the influence of addiction.
So food in general is
also
addictive.
Yeah. And when they looked at the addictive components, the level of addiction was not comparable to like a drug addiction per se. And they do mention that as well. This isn't like that level of addiction.
Got you.
So risk factors.
Yeah, back to the risk factors. So, there is this condition that diabetics can get in, type 1 specifically, where they can get into diabetic ketoacidosis, high levels of ketones. Ketones are more acidic, and so when they increase in the bloodstream, when your blood pH is disrupted, it disrupts everything in your body. All your cells and the enzymes within your cells, they're super selfish. Well, I shouldn't say selfish. They're really picky. Like if the temperature's too high or too low, they're going to be like, I'm not going to do anything. And then if the pH is off, they're going to be like, I'm not going to do anything. And they just don't work. So you never want to be hyperthermic, hypothermic, or have an imbalance in blood pH. Otherwise, your body's not going to function properly. Organs aren't going to function properly. And so ketoacidosis occurs in type 1 individuals where they have this high glucose level, but they aren't able to store that glucose and utilize it as energy. So the body doesn't even know this glucose is there. And it's like, whoa, we have no sugar. We need to convert fats to ketones. Did I even talk about the process of why ketones are a thing? Sorry, guys.
So no idea.
So when I bring up ketones, like
I can't remember.
just for the listeners, when you're restricted in carbohydrates, your body's able to take fatty acids, shuttle them to the liver, and convert them into ketones. Ketones can then be sent out into the body and utilized by organs to break them down and utilize as fuel. So it's almost like your body, when it's on a low-carb diet and doesn't have a lot of glucose, because your body loves breaking down glucose, it's like, well, you know what, let's take that fat and let's convert it into and utilize it as energy. And so that's what ketones are. And they'll circulate around in your body. There's different forms of ketones, but they can all be broken down and utilized as energy. Having high levels of ketones drops your blood pH, makes it more acidic. This happens in type 1 diabetics because they have high glucose and their body's not responding to that level of glucose. So it's creating ketones to such a high degree that it impacts blood pH. And so people are worried, okay, if you're on a keto diet and you're increasing ketones, could you get ketoacidosis? And it doesn't seem like that's what's happening. Your body's metabolically regulating in a healthy way. It doesn't have this metabolic condition like type 1 diabetes. It's able to comfortably produce ketones at a level that your body needs and isn't going to overproduce them. So that's a risk that people will bring up, but it doesn't seem to play out that way. As far as other risk factors go, other than like certain metabolic enzyme deficiencies, like which are extremely rare, I wouldn't say there's a inherent risk of these. When they're assessed, it seems to be that either diet, low carb, low fat, these balanced restricted diets, they all have really good responses when calories are restricted in terms of A1C levels, which is a measure of long-term glucose or glucose levels over the past few months, insulin responses, lipids, body weight, body fat, all these metrics are improving. They're improving at a similar fashion. So I wouldn't say there's any specific risk factors here.
Okay.
They seem to be pretty well-rounded diets. If you look at them, like you can still have vegetables in both. You can still have your protein in both, and you can still have carbs in both technically.
Yeah, so you're still getting getting fiber, you're still getting protein,
everything you need.
Yeah.
You're just kind of swaying heavily one direction versus the other.
Mm-hmm. And so you're just messing around with the carb fat ratio is all you're doing. And there's other diseases that it seems to play a role in. And a new area that's coming out is irritable bowel syndrome and limiting fiber. I mean, even the research on limiting carbohydrates and Crohn's disease and fiber intake specifically. We talked about Crohn's disease in the Carnivore Diet podcast, but that's an extreme approach here to like limiting all plant components. But fiber specifically, there's a study showing that it may have an impact on Crohn's disease here too, which in a low carbohydrate diet, decreasing that could influence it. We'll see how that plays out. But I could see the low carb diet playing a role in a variety of diseases when utilized with people that respond well to it, can adhere to it, and enjoy it. But when you think of it in terms of like recommending a diet to someone, it's pretty clear that the response is the same when you're matched for calories and protein. So whatever's easiest for you. Like me personally, when I was doing the keto diet, like it was cool because I lost weight, but I felt really restricted. I love cookies. I love pizza.
I could crush cookies.
And like, I don't overeat these things on a flexible dieting approach because I know how many calories overall I can take in. But when I don't have to think about the carb fat ratio, it makes it easier for me personally. What I'm not saying is that a flexible diet is recommended for everyone. But also what I'm not saying is that a keto diet is better than other diets. I'm also not saying I want to bring this up because everyone hears these points and it's like, oh, Dr. Luke's anti-keto, like, you know, all this, like, I don't know. It creates these, people don't listen to what I'm actually saying and instead just create this exaggeration.
They cherry pick the data.
Yeah. Well, or assume that I'm cherry picking the data.
Right.
And yeah, so as far as risks go, I don't really, sure, you could argue the point too of a keto diet increasing saturated fat. That's an argument that's made, but that doesn't seem to be happening, especially when you're calorically restricted. There doesn't seem to be a difference in cholesterol levels. And in fact, the keto diet was shown in one review to increase HDL, which we think is a good thing. And so, yeah, I wouldn't say it's negative. There is a group of literature on the reads like, how long is this guy going to fucking There is a group of
We got
literature.
a tea time to get to, you know.
Oh, we still haven't even talked about the war of the Twitter war. We might have to split this into two parts. So there's a group of research on like exercise and resistance training and endurance athletes and all this stuff on the keto diet. And it seems to be, when you look at isocaloric conditions, so this is a 2022 meta-analysis, higher carbs was better for athletes after any instance of glycogen depletion. So if they didn't have high glycogen stores, a high carbohydrate diet pre-exercise was better. And
I was
then
reading that, like, athletes, it's not ideal for athletes to go
the
on
keto diet,
Yeah,
unless, so there's a separate meta-analysis in 2017 that showed that endurance athletes, after they can become adapted to the low carb, high fat diet, do have an advantage because they can upregulate fat oxidation so much to sustain that level of endurance training. And these were like high level endurance athletes that were providing this benefit, but the metabolic changes were, I don't see the time.
We
frame.
went from risks back to benefits.
Well, because I wanted to touch on the training thing before we quit. There's so much more. So if you're in the 2022 meta-analysis, they say like the low carb, high fat diet may not impact training very much unless you're doing 10 or more sets per muscle group in a session, which like if you're training for hypertrophy, a lot of times, like I'm doing well more than 10 sets per muscle group. So I do take in more carbohydrates for my training specifically. But if you're doing less than 10 sets, which tends to be more full body workouts, high intensity interval training, and people that aren't focused on muscle growth, hypertrophy specifically, or strength, then a low carb diet actually probably won't impair that at all. But you're going to want carbs if you're doing high volume.
Let's touch up on resistance training. Are there any like increased benefits that you see of going on these diets? You see more muscle mass, or do you see any decreases in muscle mass going on these diets?
So that's what I was just bringing up. That 2022 analysis showed there isn't difference high carb versus low carb unless you're glycogen depleted off the bat, which means you don't have stored glucose. Then you're going to want to supplement with a carbohydrate meal beforehand, or if you're doing high volume, so more than 10 sets. Yeah. But there isn't like, one of these diets didn't improve hypertrophy more than the other.
So it's not like the vegan diet where it's like, oh, you see substantially less muscle growth. You'll lose weight, but you're not going to see the gains you would with eating meat unless you supplement with protein powders or more protein.
Could you say that again?
You're just looking deep in my
Yeah, I
eyes.
was like, I don't know what you just
He was
said.
talking about the veggie supplement.
Oh, I'm just
No, I
saying,
know,
like,
but-
you're not going to see any decrease like you would vegan, where you have to supplement compared, because like that
No.
one you saw muscle loss. Yeah, they lost weight, but they lost muscle as well. Like
Yeah.
you're not going to lose muscle as much as that.
So not according to this paper here where they looked at it with resistance training, but if you go on a low-fat diet, a lot of people will go mostly plant-based. That is pretty popular,
Oh, okay.
and that's talked about in one of these studies too. So if you are going plant-based and you're restricting protein, tune into the protein episode and also the vegan or vegetarian episode where we talk about composition of plant versus animal protein.
Carnivore one's pretty good too.
Yeah, tune into that one.
Spicy.
There's another point with to just drive home the sugar thing. I thought was kind of interesting. There's studies assessing hunter-gatherer tribes. A lot of people have this like, oh, my ancestors ate only meat, like with the carnivore diet and stuff, and like, oh, we're only supposed to eat this. You look at
They were hunter
evolutionarily.
gatherers.
Well,
They
yeah.
got what they could get.
The problem is it's not consistent. We were all over the place globally, different environments, different plants, different animals. It's like we don't have this one diet. And I don't know how to convince people of that. If it's not clear to you now, then it may never be. But we don't have a one-size-fits-all approach to nutrition.
Yeah.
But there is a couple or a few different studies assessing hunter-gatherer tribes that still exist. And this is pretty popular in the literature when you go look at these groups of people that still live the ways that their ancestors did and don't let this, society influence such as, like our ways of living. So they still live the ways that their ancestors did, eat the same foods and such. And so one particular group, the Hazda tribe in Tanzania, they get 15% of their year-round calories from honey, in addition to some other sources, but 15% sugar, mainly fructose. They don't get obesity, type 2 diabetes and such, like people seem to say like sugar and fructose cause this. There's two other tribes too, the Booty Pygmies in Congo. They, during the rainy season, were shown to have 80% of their calories come from sugar, and they don't get these diseases either. The Kuna tribe in Panama has 17% of calories from sugar all year round, which is more than Americans. According to the NHANES data, which is a compilation of all, we've talked about the NHANES trial and the survey analysis of the United States and how we eat and things. We take in 13% of our diet as sugar, so that's less than this Kuna tribe in Panama, but somehow they're protected from disease. And you look at population trends, people like to highlight, oh, the increase in sugar is correlated with the increase in obesity. That's actually not true. When you plot out the NHANES data, there is, and I'll just flip this to show it to you guys. So listeners, we're just going to link to the study. So that orange line there is obesity, and sugar is the blue one. What do you see happening with sugar right around between 1995
sugar's
and
going
2000.
down and obesity's going up. It's doing
Ding, 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 ding,
steady
ding.
uptick.
Yeah. So no, sugar intake in the U.S. is not parallel
It's
with
the
obesity.
overconsumption.
Exactly. And I bring, and that actually, so
Like-
Kevin Hall has a cool study. So guys, I got so much. Kevin Hall has a cool study of food availability, and this is done globally, 52 different countries. And they looked at high, medium, and low income countries and looked at when more food was available, what happened to food intake and incidence of obesity. And with more food available, people were consuming more. And so when you have this increased food availability, especially the non-nutrient dense, high calorically, highly palatable foods, you're over consuming. That's really, really clear. So yeah, it's overconsumption. So people stop hating on all the sugar and all this stuff and trying to pretend like why obesity is happening, because there's like the smartest people in the world having debates on obesity, but yet someone online seems to have the answer in the comments. So these guys, like people listening, go tune into Kevin Hall and Robert Ludwig and look at their sides and their theories on obesity and where they talk about insulin and sugar. It's super interesting. And I'd be curious to see if you guys did, like, whose side you're on. It's really cool because they're going at it right now. Like I said, last night, Robert Ludwig came out and redid an analysis on Kevin Hall's study where I said people stayed at the metabolic ward for 4 weeks.
Oh, he copied it, but did
no,
it in
he
his
actually
way?
went into the data that's publicly available, reanalyzed it in a way that changed what the Kevin Hall study found. And Kevin Hall was like, they didn't ask for all the data. They left out 4 participants in one of the group, which turned out to be 40% of the participants. And they're trying to make this argument that there was this, not to get so far into the weeds, but some people might find this interesting. They had them do 2 weeks of a low carb diet, then 2 weeks of the low fat diet. They were randomized in which diet they started, but they didn't have a washout period in between. So one diet just switched to the next diet. And so Robert Ludwig's group and the folks at Harvard were like, well, if you started on one diet, it influenced the other. But Kevin Hall showed there wasn't a significant impact on that. But when Ludwig's group went in and took the publicly available data, they changed the statistical analysis to show that there was a significant effect. But now Kevin Hall, last night, and we'll have to hop on Twitter here and see how this is going, but he's like, no, you didn't ask for all the data. Here's why your analysis was actually incorrect, because you're not looking at the primary outcome we looked at, which dictates the statistical analysis and how we do these studies. And so there's this war going on where, these are the most intelligent researchers leading the way in the studies that are ongoing, and they have inconsistent answers. But again,
That's
your
crazy.
cousin's brother's friend who heard on a podcast that the carnivore diet is the best way to eat seems to have all the answers, but these guys don't.
We might want to take that out. But
No,
but I'll just say, okay.
I'm
We
not
were
telling
talking-
you that
No.
it is wrong. I'm
No,
not
yeah,
telling
that's
you
the problem.
What
is
I'm not saying
you're
is
hearing what you want to hear.
Yep.
You stop listening when you hear something you don't want to hear, and that's the end of it.
yeah.
And it's happening everywhere. And
Yeah.
I
That's just,
I hope the
2024
listeners out
social
there
media.
trust us, because we are trustworthy guys.
Well,
here
and,
for
and
you
go
guys.
ahead and read into the research and form your own
Yeah,
conclusions.
you're
of
also
these.
giving everybody the content right there. The information
Read the
is right
studies.
there.
I encourage you.
Read them. But then again, you always want to, if somebody, like, for example, the carnivore, we were getting a lot of feedback. And if somebody does have research that shows a positive effect that you haven't found, but you want to see it because you would love to see that, right?
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
please provide me everything else that you find personally. And you can contact us on our website. You can submit that on our social media page. But yeah, all the research, more research, the better.
Sounds like
So-
we're kind of wrapping up here.
Well, yeah, I want to just say what I am not saying. Like when we talk about this low carb, low fat diet, it seems to be pretty clear that it doesn't matter which way you choose, as long as you figure out what works best for you to be calorically restricted if your goal is fat loss, improved metabolic health, cardiovascular health. A low fat diet is not superior to those and doesn't seem to have some independent effect on health. What I'm not saying is that a keto diet doesn't work. I'm not saying a low carb diet doesn't work. It absolutely does for a variety of individuals, and the studies that we went over do represent that. It's just not superior. And what I'm also not saying is that the carnivore diet doesn't work, but there isn't evidence suggesting that it is more beneficial to your health. And that you'll have to tune into that podcast.
This is a hard one to choose between. I don't think there is a clear winner, but
They're pretty similar.
Yeah, what do you think?
Yeah, summarize who's the winner.
I
of
mean,
this
we
matchup here.
have to have one move on, right?
So
Where would you go with this one?
So I actually was thinking about this, and I didn't make a decision, but I will. Like, I was kind of factoring in, okay, all the research, what is it telling us? And it is like there doesn't seem to be a clear winner here. But if I'm going to choose one, I'm going low carb because of the long-term meta-analyses that had that 3 to 6 month time point and then the 12 month. At 3 to 6 month, people 3 to 6 months, people tended to adhere better to that low carb diet and had likely because of that initial water weight and weight loss. But there's that adherence aspect at the beginning, which I preach all the time. If you can find something that people adhere to more, then it's going to be better for them. Plus, this area of research on epilepsy and apparently Alzheimer's, and other metabolic conditions. So I'd say, but again, low fat diets may play a role in those diseases when calories are controlled as well, if it's a calorically restricted aspect, which stay tuned, that might be the case. But yeah, I think that low carb, just having this, especially epilepsy patients, like the adherence aspect in epilepsy.
You almost have to look at the benefits and see which one has, like, what you're saying, the Alzheimer's and epilepsy stuff. So,
it just hasn't been studied in low fat. So it's not saying low fat, it doesn't contribute to these things when calories are restricted. It's, if I had to choose, it's low carb, but I am not saying low carb is a superior diet to low fat, because long term, again, the adherence just ends up leveling out. Low carb versus any calorie restricted diet when matched for calories and protein. So yeah, low carb's the winner of this one.
All right. That was my choice too.
Yeah, the whole thing to drive home is we've been having these dichotomous debates of nutrition, and there's so much research out there that is inconsistent, which makes it so crazy when people make all these claims about knowing the nutritional answers here. So take this evidence, and this is meant to just provide some level of nuance to the discussion of nutrition, so that you can decide for yourselves how you feel.
Cool.
Thanks for listening, everybody. It was great. Wow.
I did not expect.
We learned a lot more than just those two diets.
Yeah, that was great. I loved it.
I love you guys.
I love you too. Well, we lost the light. I'm
gonna miss you guys. Should we go eat some carbs?
Thanks again for tuning in to the Kickback Science Podcast. We love talking science with all of you, and if you feel the same, you can support us by subscribing, hitting that like button, and giving us a follow on our social media pages. Don't forget, you can submit questions through our website and in the comments section of all our social media. Have a good one, everyone.